Imagine a quiet morning in a small town. People are enjoying their first coffee, the birds are singing, and everything seems peaceful, until a deafening sound is heard. A huge piano falls off the balcony and falls right onto a passerby. The target of this barbaric prank is an elderly black man. But what the perpetrator clearly did not expect was who his son would turn out to be. What happened next will make your heart beat faster. This is a story not just about bias and cruelty, but about how lives can be turned upside down in an instant. Dear viewers, we want to get to know you better. Write in the comments what your name is and from what city you watch us. Each of you is incredibly important to our channel. It's you, your feedback and your comments that help us grow this community. Thank you for being with us, and don't forget, your voice is what makes us stronger. Subscribe, give us likes and write your opinion about this story. We really care what you think. Enjoy the show. In the small town of Brighton, known for its quiet and measured life, the day began as calmly as ever. A light breeze gently ruffled the leaves of the old oak trees, and the early rays of the sun cast a warm golden glow over the streets. People were hurrying to their favorite coffee shop on the corner to start their morning with a fragrant cup of coffee. Among them was Henry Wilson, a 72-year-old black man with a kind smile and a tired look that reflected years of hard but honest living. Henry went, as usual, to get a newspaper and his favorite cinnamon bun. He walked leisurely down the street, admiring the silence and remembering his youth, when life had seemed simpler. His cane tapped softly on the pavement, and a slight cough betrayed his age and health, inexorably eroded by years of hard work. Bill Clark stood on the third floor of one of the old houses, with a balcony overlooking the street, a 45-year-old man with sharp features and a hard stare. He was known among his neighbors for his rudeness and disdain for those who were different from him. Bill loved to feel like the boss and hated anything that caused him even a hint of discomfort. On this day, something was particularly annoying to him. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the loud laughter of the children outside. But when he saw Henry walking down the sidewalk, a long familiar hatred flared inside him. "Look who's here," Bill muttered with a chuckle. He stepped out onto the balcony, leaning against the rusty railing. Downstairs, Henry slowed to consider the headline on the front page of the newspaper he'd just bought. As Bill continued to watch, he remembered that there was an old piano on his balcony, left over from the previous owners. It hadn't been used for a long time, and Bill had been meaning to get rid of it, but hadn't gotten around to it. At that moment, an absurd thought flashed through his mind, which quickly turned into a plan. What if I got rid of this junk right now, and do something useful with it? He tapped one of the piano's legs with the edge of his shoe, testing to see how easily it could be moved. The old instrument shook, but held steady. Henry stopped just under the balcony to adjust his shopping bag. The silence of the morning was broken by a deafening creak. Bill pushed the piano with all his might, and it tilted and tumbled downward. For a moment, everything stood still. The falling instrument, the frightened shouts of passersby, the confused look on Henry's face as he looked up. And then the silence was replaced by a terrible rumble that shook the ground. The piano crashed to the sidewalk, and Henry collapsed to the ground. The silence returned, but it was different, heavy, full of shock and fear. People hurrying to get coffee and buns stopped, looking around for the source of the sound. Some shouted, others ran to the scene. Henry was lying among the wreckage of the piano, and Bill's hoarse laughter sounded from the balcony above. "That's it, you old degenerate," he tossed. Leaning over the railing, it seemed to him that he had won a small victory, but even he could not have foreseen how cruelly fate would repay him for this deed. A little before that terrible rumble that shook the street, Henry was walking, not realizing that his morning would turn out to be a nightmare. He was walking past the house where Bill stood on the third floor, his hands resting on the rusty railing of the balcony. Henry saw him out of the corner of his eye, but tried to ignore him. He knew better than to mess with people like Bill. But Bill had already concentrated all his attention on the old man. He disliked everything: Henry's calm gait, his neat clothes, the confidence with which he moved despite his age. "Hey, you!" came a mocking voice from above. Henry frowned, not immediately realizing it was him. Yes, you old black bag of bones. Are you deaf up there?" Henry stopped, raised his head, and met Bill's gaze. He was looking down at him with an expression of contempt and gloating. There was something dangerous in Bill's eyes that made Henry tense. "Why do you walk around here every day?" Bill continued, louder so everyone could hear him. You should be at home in your own neighborhood, not stinking up the place first thing in the morning." Henry didn't answer, just pretended not to hear, and tried to walk past, but Bill was not about to let his victim go. "Oh, look at him," he continued, addressing an imaginary audience. "You think he's just like everybody else here, don't you? Maybe you think you're just as human as the rest of us. Have you forgotten where you belong?" The words pierced Henry, but it tried to keep his temper in check. He dealt with people like Bill before, and he knew that any word in response would only make things worse. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Bill shouted, his face red with anger. He grabbed a milk can from the balcony, which still had some paint in it, and threw it down. The can missed and fell near Henry's feet, spilling yellow paint onto the asphalt. "Oh, I'm sorry," Bill chuckled. "My hands are slippery today." The crowd began to stop, paying attention to what was happening. Some whispered, some looked on with judgment, but no one dared to interface, and Bill continued to taunt. "Why don't you say something, old man? I can see you have something to say. Come on, tell me how you earned your pennies. Do we have a professor walking around, or a janitor?" Henry looked up slowly, and for a moment his eyes met Bill's. There was no fear in them, only weariness and dignity, which infuriated Bill even more. "What? Are you looking at me like that? You think you're smarter than me? You think you're better than me?" Bill shouted angrily, feeling the irritation growing inside him. "All right, I'll show you who's boss." He turned to the piano on the balcony. At that moment, even the neighbor from the apartment across the hall, who had heard the noise, looked out of the window. "Bill, what are you doing?" she shouted. "It's dangerous." But Bill only laughed. "Hey, shut up. There's a parenting class going on. Don't interface." Henry stopped under the balcony, looking at the raging man. He didn't want to get into a conflict, but it seemed that he wasn't going to be allowed to just walk away. And then Bill took the first step toward turning this morning into a bloody nightmare. The noise in the street began to attract more and more attention. People stopped, looked at each other, whispered, trying to figure out what was going on. But upstairs, on the third-floor balcony, Bill was focused only on his show. In his head, an evil mixture of adrenaline and hatred, fueled by the indifference of the people around him, was heating up. "What, did you think you could just walk through like that?" he hissed, glaring at Henry, who was now standing directly under his balcony, trying to remain calm. Bill's fingers were already touching the edges of the piano. It was a massive, old instrument, covered in scratches and dust. It had stood there for years, abandoned and unwanted, but now, in Bill's mind, it had become a weapon capable of crushing not only his body, but everything this old man symbolized to him. Henry looked up. His tired gaze met Bill's eyes. There was something in that gaze that made Bill freeze for a moment. Not fear, not pleading, but a quiet dignity that made him even more furious. "You think you're better than me?" Bill shouted, as if reading the old man's mind. His voice was hoarse with anger. "You're not even worth standing here." With these words, he pressed his shoulder into the old instrument. The piano moved slowly, creaking and emitting a long groan from the old wood. The neighbor, who continued to watch from the window across the street, shouted, "Bill, are you crazy? Stop it." But there was no stopping him. "Shut up," he shouted, looking over his shoulder. It was time he learned his place. The piano tilted. The creaking of metal intensified as the instrument began to slide off the balcony. The crowd in the street gasped. Someone tried to shout for Henry to move away, but it was too late. Time slowed down. Henry looked up, and his eyes widened as he saw a massive black silhouette hovering over him. Before he could even react, the piano snapped. For one brief moment, silence fell as if the street itself were holding its breath, and then a sound cut through that air, a terrible, deafening sound, like the roar of an angry beast. The piano came crashing down with incredible force. The first blow hit the asphalt, scattering splinters of wood and metal. The second hit Henry's body, which collapsed under the weight of the debris. The deafening crack of bones, and the thud of a body falling were the final notes of the nightmare. Screams filled the air. People started running to the scene, some grabbing phones to call an ambulance. One young man in the crowd covered his face with his hands, unable to look at the scene. Bill stood on the balcony. His eyes glittered with adrenaline, and the corners of his lips quivered in a wicked grin. He felt like he'd just won a victory. He glanced down at his creation, the broken piano lying next to the old man's motionless body. "Do you like it?" he mumbled hoarsely to himself. but his voice didn't sound so confident anymore. Somewhere inside, something like unease began to creep in. The crowd huddled around Henry. Some were trying to bring him to his senses. Some were searching for where life remained in the fragile body. People were screaming, calling for help, but no one dared look up at the man who had just done the deed. It was only the neighbor, clasping her hands at her mouth, who whispered, "Jesus, what have you done, Bill?" He didn't answer. He stood clinging to the railing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt his heart begin to clench in his chest. There was a sepulchral silence in the street, as if the whole town had frowned. Realizing what had just happened, Henry lay motionless on the pavement, amid the shattered wreckage of the piano. His cane had rolled to the side, and beside it lay a crumpled newspaper half soaked with blood. The first to react was a young woman with a baby in her arms. Her face turned pale, and her lips trembled as she covered the child's eyes so that he would not see the scene. "Oh my God," she exhaled, barely holding the baby who, not realizing what was happening, began to cry. The crowd began to slowly gather around the scene of the tragedy. People approached cautiously, as if they were afraid that the wreckage of the piano would suddenly come to life and attack them. Some of the bolder ones crept closer to see if Henry was alive, but stepped back at the sight of his bloody body and broken limbs. Is this him on purpose?" the elderly man asked, addressing the passers-by, but there was no response. There was a hum of voices over the scene, but no one dared to speak loudly. It was as if the whole street were shackled with terror, each feeling an icy weight on his shoulders. The whispering grew into a subdued cacophony. "Did anyone call an ambulance?" a man in a tracksuit shouted, holding a cell phone in his hands. "Jesus, what was that all about?" "It's him," a woman with a handkerchief tied around her head shouted, pointing her finger at the balcony where Bill still stood. "He's the one who threw the piano down. I saw him." Heads began to rise up. People searched with their eyes for the culprit, and there, on the balcony, they saw Bill. He stood, still clinging to the railing, and seemed confused. His eyes darted around the crowd, but instead of the triumph he had felt a moment before, fear was growing inside. "Are you out of your mind?" shouted the neighbor across the street, leaning out the window again. "You killed him, Bill. Do you realize that?" These words echoed through the crowd like thunder. Did he do that on purpose?" someone whispered. "Is this some kind of joke?" said the other, his voice trembling. "Who does that anyway?" Some people started pulling out their phones, filming what was happening. Cameras pointed at the balcony, capturing Bill's face, which no longer had any of its former insolence. Panic grew like a wave. Someone in the crowd tried to approach Henry to check for a pulse, but recoiled when he saw a pool of blood spreading across the pavement. "Did anyone call the police? An ambulance?" the same young woman screamed, unable to hold back her tears. Sirens began to be heard somewhere in the distance. It was a signal that the time of calm was over. Bill, hearing them, turned even paler. He suddenly realized that all these people, all these cameras, were now witnesses. "Look, it's an accident," he shouted from the balcony, trying to shout over the noise of the crowd. "I didn't mean to. He was standing there himself. His words drowned in the outrage of the people. "You dumped it on him," shouted a man from the crowd. "You did it on purpose. We all saw it." The crowd began to approach the house, humming threateningly. People were no longer just whispering. They were accusing, shouting, demanding justice. The woman holding the baby could hardly hold back her tears. "That man just killed an old man," she shouted, raising her hand, "in front of all of us." Bill tried to say something, but his voice sounded pathetic and weak. He felt as if the air around him had become viscous, and the stares of people were blades that cut him from the inside. Meanwhile, the sirens were getting louder and louder, and the tension on the street was building. There was shock in everyone's eyes, but that shock was beginning to turn to rage. What started out as a harmless morning had turned into a scene that would haunt every witness for a long time. Bill stood on the balcony, clutching the rusty railing, as if it could keep him safe from the anger of the mob that was growing below. But despite the realization that he had gone too far, deep inside he was still torn by a sense of angry satisfaction. He looked down at the confused faces of the people. Down there, amid the wreckage of the piano, still lying motionless on the pavement, was Henry. His thin body, surrounded by blood and his cane, looked so frail and defenseless that it only made Bill's pride swell. He felt he had proved something even if he couldn't yet explain what it was. That's what happens when you don't know who's in charge, he muttered under his breath, the corners of his lips quivering in a grin. That thought galvanized him. The adrenaline that had just turned to confusion turned to anger again. He felt like a doomsayer. That old man deserved it. He knew what he was doing when he tried to walk down my street like he was my equal. Bill convinced himself. Shouts reached him from below. The crowd grew louder and louder. People were shouting, demanding his arrest, accusing him of murder. But instead of being framed, Bill felt the contempt burning inside him. Murder, he muttered, furrowing his brow and looking down again. You're all the same. All you can do is point fingers. He stuck out his chest defiantly and shouted into the crowd. What are you gonna do? What's in it for me? It was just an accident. You shouldn't have been standing there. Those words sounded like an explosion. Someone in the crowd shouted, You bastard, you did it all on purpose. We all saw it. But instead of remorse, Bill felt only a growing anger. It seemed to him that these people below were nothing, unable to understand him. Their outrage only fueled his hatred. On purpose, he laughed, taking a step back and resting his hands on his hips. You've got to be kidding me. It's his own fault. He belongs under the piano, not on my street. Everyone heard the words. The crowd frowned for a moment, then erupted in a roar of condemnation. People were shouting, some trying to get closer to the house, others filming on their phones, capturing Bill's every word. A neighbor from another balcony, who had been watching the whole time, screamed, Are you out of your mind? Bill, do you realize you just killed a man? This is not a game. But her voice did not reach him. He turned to her again and shouted, What's in it for me? You think that's gonna stop me? He felt out of control, as if he were above all these people. It seemed to him that he was still in control, that he could impose his will on those around him, as he had done with Henry. But inside, deep beneath all that bravado, anxiety was beginning to swarm. Bill saw people taking pictures of him on cameras. He realized that sooner or later, these videos would end up on the police, on the news, in the public eye. However, he immediately suppressed that fear within himself. His anger was too strong to allow himself to admit any guilt. So be it, he muttered, leaning on the railing again. I'm right. I've always been right, and none of them can take that away from me. But beneath those words, beneath the fake sense of superiority, a subtle crack was already beginning to show in his eyes. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he had done something irreparable, but fear and guilt could not yet break through the rage that was blinding his mind. At this time, the shouts from below grew louder and louder. People were no longer just judging. They were crying out for justice, and the sirens, getting closer and closer to the scene, signaled that Bill's sense of superiority was about to collapse like a piano. The crowd, huddled around Henry's motionless body, stood in horrified silence, interrupted only by occasional sobs and whispers. On the pavement, among the splinters of wood and shards of metal, the elderly man lay face down. His weak, frail body looked so lifeless that some of the witnesses began to think the worst. He's bleeding, a lot of blood, the young woman muttered, pointing to a puddle that was getting bigger. Someone finally decided to act. It was the man in the tracksuit, the same man who had been the first to yell for an ambulance. He knelt down beside Henry, trying to avoid the sharp edges of the piano. His hands were shaking, but he checked the pulse on the victim's neck. He's alive, he exhaled, and it was as if that dropped the tension from the crowd a little. Stand back. Give me room, shouted one of the women. We have to do something. What can we do? The older man asked, looking around. His voice was filled with helplessness. He's covered in blood. Look at his legs. Henry's legs were at a strange angle, unnaturally twisted, as if the bones were no longer held together. His back was covered with splintered wood and dirt, and a scarlet stain was slowly spreading next to his head. We need to turn him over, the man in the tracksuit began, but he was interrupted by a woman with a headscarf. Are you out of your mind? You can make him worse. We have to wait for an ambulance. What if he dies now? Shouted someone from the crowd. Would we just stand by and watch? The screaming was getting worse. Panic was growing. People were arguing, trying to figure out what to do. Some were already trying to call the ambulance again, and some were just standing on the sidelines, covering their mouths with their hands, unable to look at the bloody body. Listen up, the man in the tracksuit said loudly, trying to shout over the chaos. If we don't help him now, He may not wait for the paramedics. He took off his jacket and gently placed it under Henry's head to raise it a little and stop the flow of blood from the wound. As he touched the man's neck, he felt a faint, barely perceptible gasp. "He's alive, but very badly," he repeated again, looking at the woman with the handkerchief. "His chest? I think his ribs are broken," someone whispered from behind him, looking at Henry's shredded ribcage, which was rising with difficulty. "Oh my God," the woman with the baby exhaled, averting her eyes. Meanwhile, the sirens were getting louder and louder. Someone in the crowd said with relief, "They'll be here soon, not much longer." But that little bit seemed like an eternity. Henry began to make faint, barely audible sounds. His fingers trembled, and that gave everyone a sigh of hope. "He's coming around," shouted a young guy with a cell phone. "Let's do something else." But when Henry turned his head slightly, opening his mouth, a little blood came out. The panic increased. Is that internal bleeding?" the girl whispered with tearful eyes, stepping back. "Quiet, everybody just shut up," shouted the man in the tracksuit. "We're not medics, but we can at least keep him breathing." The crowd began to calm down a little, but the eyes of the people were increasingly drawn to the balcony, where Bill was still standing. He was looking down with an unpleasant mixture of anger and fear. "The bastard's just watching," shouted someone from the crowd. "He doesn't even try to come down and help." Someone grabbed a small stone and threw it toward the house. The stone hit the wall, missing its target, but a shout of hatred rippled through the crowd. "We'll remember you, you bastard," they shouted from downstairs. But Bill was silent. His face was tense, and a storm was brewing inside. On the one hand, he could feel the fear of what was coming next overwhelming him. On the other, his pride and hatred still kept him from making any move toward apology or remorse. Sirens tore through the air, blocking out the noise of the crowd. 2 ambulances and a police car arrived at the scene. The medics quickly ran out with stretchers, ignoring the crowd's shouts, and got to work. The crowd retreated, giving them space, but their faces remained tense. Many continued to take pictures on their phones, capturing every detail. "Is he alive? Is he alive?" someone shouted. "Stay out of the way," one of the medics replied sharply, lowering himself next to Henry's body. They quickly began to stop the bleeding, checking his breathing and the condition of his injuries. Every step they took caused a wave of hope mixed with horror among the gathered people. Henry let out a quiet groan. His fingers clenched weakly. "He's fighting," said someone in the crowd. "He's not giving up." But no one knew if he had the strength to survive such a terrifying blow. When the paramedics finally carried Henry into the ambulance and drove off to the hospital, the crowd gradually began to disperse. The noise was fading, but the tension that remained in the air hung like a fog. People were still talking, discussing what had happened, trying to figure out how such a terrible tragedy could have happened. But amidst all this talk, with each new question that became part of this tragedy, there was one that gradually grew louder and more insistent. Who was this man? Who was Henry? Why had his life been subjected to such brutal violence? A voice in the crowd grew more and more interested, as someone noticed details that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. "Hey, did you notice?" asked the guy who was closest to the scene. He was younger than the others, and his eyes were full of questions. He had expensive shoes and a watch. It didn't look like the stuff of a plain old man. "Really?" nodded the woman who was walking beside him. "I noticed that, too. It was like he was from a different circle. And he didn't look homeless," added another voice, followed by another. "He had an expensive suit. Look at his briefcase." Those words were beginning to shift the perception of what had happened. Henry, who had seemed like a victim of random cruelty, now looked like someone much more important than a simple old man. People began to reconsider everything that had happened. "Who is he, anyway? Why was he on this street this morning?" the boy continued, increasingly filled with curiosity. The questions escalated, but no one could answer them. The medics left so quickly that no one had time to learn more about Henry, and his papers were likely still in the ambulance. But here's what was strange. When one of the police officers, who arrived later, was looking through the scene, he noticed one item that was not damaged, a thin leather wallet that had fallen out of Henry's pocket. The policeman slowly picked it up and opened it. Inside, in addition to the money, he found a card, obviously very important to the owner. "Look," he said. handing the card to the senior officers. "This is not just any old man. Look who this man is." Everyone's attention immediately turned to the police, who were now focused on the card. Trying not to attract unnecessary attention, the police began to examine the information. Name, Henry Harris. The officers read aloud. Profession, security consultant. Some in the crowd stopped talking, listening warily. Security consultant. Who would have thought it? To the average person, that sounded out of place with the image of an elderly man who could barely move. "It wasn't just some old man," the woman standing next to the policeman muttered. "He knew something. His profession. It was important." The words security consultant sounded like music to the ears of most. It was a mystery that now demanded to be solved. People were beginning to realize that Henry was more than just a random victim. His profession, his actions, his place in the world, all of it was becoming important. One of the witnesses standing by uttered a phrase that became the basis for all that followed. "If he's a security consultant, what was he doing outside at a time like this? Why was he there when it all happened? Who knew him and could have gotten into his life?" There were no answers to these questions, but one thing was clear: there was something more behind this tragedy. Someone may have wanted Henry to keep quiet, or not wanted his past to come out. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but each person present carried more and more questions with them. Every glance at the piano, now shadowed, awakened new ideas. Who was Henry Harris, and how was his life connected with what had happened on the street that morning? Everyone gathered now felt that those who Saturday in the shadows could actually be far more dangerous than they appeared at first glance. The calm that the street was gradually recovering from the noise and panic was suddenly broken by the rumble of a powerful vehicle. A black SUV suddenly appeared, and a lane was instantly cleared for it as soon as its headlights illuminated the road. The people, who had not yet fully recovered from the experience, began to look at the approaching car with wariness. The SUV stopped right at the curb, and a man got out of it, which immediately attracted attention. He was tall, in a strict suit, with a confident gait, and he moved with such purpose that he attracted the stares of passers-by. This man was clearly not the type to walk down the street without purpose. He was visibly tense, his expression growing more and more anxious with each step. When the car door opened and a man stepped out, it was obvious who he was. It was Henry Harris's son Julian. His face was scowling, his steps quick and determined. He walked quickly around the car and, without waiting for help from his driver, headed toward the scene of the accident. "Where's my father?" His voice was calm, but there was a shadow of panic in it. "Where is he?" The distinct thud of his boots on the pavement was heard as he approached the policemen, who were still in the center of the action. One of them tried to approach him and start an explanation, but Julian interrupted him, ignoring the obstacles. "You don't understand. It's my father. I must be with him." For a moment his voice broke with excitement. He turned sharply to the crowd, which once again began to move away, realizing that someone important had come into their little story. A moment later the policeman, realizing the importance of the situation, stepped back. Julian stepped forward, heading straight for the spot where the wallet had just been examined. His eyes swiftly swept the neighborhood, glancing over the blood smeared on the pavement, the empty ambulance that had already left, and finally stopping at one spot, the empty spot where his father had once stood. The same policeman who had just given Julian the information about his father's identity stood in front of him. His face wasn't as hard now as it had been before. Julian looked at him with slight concern, though he didn't hold his gaze for too long. "Where is my father?" he repeated, his voice strained. "What's wrong with him?" "We've just taken him to the hospital," the policeman replied, feeling the weight of the words weighing on his shoulders. "His condition is extremely serious. He has multiple injuries. You should know that we can't say for sure how it will end." It was as if those words had sapped Julian of his strength. He tilted his head slightly and rubbed his chin, trying to comprehend what he had heard. A moment of confusion flickered in his eyes, but he quickly gathered himself, shrunk back, and pulled himself together. "We went there immediately," he finally said. "Please tell me who did this." He turned around, his gaze fixed on the man standing a little farther away. Bill. That gaze was cold, as direct as a blow. He knew that this was the man who seemed to be responsible for this whole nightmare. Bill felt a chill run through his body. His gaze met Julian's eyes, and all his earlier confidence and anger melted away like snow in the sun. It was the very moment he realized that everything was for a reason. The man in front of him was not just the son of the victim, but someone who could destroy everything he had ever known about his own safety and position. Julian walked slowly toward him. Every step he took made Bill feel his body grow heavy, as if the ground beneath his feet were dissolving. "You did it?" Julian said, stepping closer. His voice was firm, but there was pain in it. You threw him off the balcony. You killed my father." The crowd was silent, all eyes fixed on them. Bill tried to avert his eyes, but they kept coming back to Julian, his confidence, his determination, and with every new word Julian said, Bill felt his situation worsen. Henry Harris's son was not just an ordinary man. He was powerful. He was someone who could shatter Bill like a grain of sand under a powerful torrent of water. I didn't know," Bill said with a tremor in his voice, realizing that the words he'd spoken meant nothing now. I didn't know that you were that kind of person." His words sounded weak, pathetic, and couldn't change what had happened. Julian was in no hurry to listen to him. He looked at Bill, and his gaze was full of determination. This was the moment he knew for sure. His father didn't deserve this, and the man standing in front of him couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. "You were wrong," Julian said, slowly but firmly. "Now you're going to find out what it means." The first few hours after Julian's appearance in town had been a nightmare for Bill. He couldn't contain the wave of confusion that swept over him like a tsunami. His mind was a mixture of fear, regret, indomitable rage, and the full realization that his life, and that of his family, was doomed to disaster. He was sure that his actions would probably have no immediate consequences. But here was what he had underestimated. Julian Harris was a man whose influence far exceeded his own. The next morning came with the smell of fear. Bill woke up with a feeling of heaviness in his chest, as if some invisible weight was pressing on his body, preventing him from breathing. Yesterday's conversation with Julian had left an imprint in his soul that wouldn't go away. He knew his life was on the brink of destruction, and this was just the beginning. Since morning, he had noticed a change in his surroundings. His coworkers, with whom he had once had an easy relationship, now avoided his gaze. A strange silence reigned in the office where he worked. He saw his coworkers chatting behind his back, whispering something to each other as it passed by. They no longer looked at him with respect. Bill could feel that look slowly turning into contempt. It was the first sign that the consequences of his actions were beginning to show. The phone rang, and Bill, anticipating that it would be a call from his wife or someone close to him, picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Do you know what's going on?" The voice on the other side was calm, but it was cold. It was his best friend, Tom, who worked in another office. Tom was someone Bill would once have talked to about anything, but now his voice wasn't what it used to be. "What happened?" Bill asked, trying to stay calm, though inwardly he was panicking. "The whole town knows who you are." Tom didn't try to hide his displeasure. "Your actions have become a cause for discussion, not only among our colleagues, but also among the people in the neighborhood. Everyone says you almost killed a man, and it is." The voice on the other end was silent, as if he didn't know what to say. "It's not just a problem, Bill. It could ruin your reputation." Bill felt a chill sweep over his body. The reputation he had spent so long building seemed as unreliable as sand. Everything he had once considered solid was threatened overnight. And if this was just about him, he could somehow cope. But this was about his family, his future. As Tom continued to explain, Bill tried to exhale. He knew he couldn't afford to panic. He was smart. He knew how to handle the situation. But the problem wasn't just what had happened. Everything Bill had done had been driven by one feeling: hate. He didn't stop, didn't think about the consequences, didn't give himself time to reflect. His vengeful act cost him much. A few hours after the call, Tom sent Bill a message that finally shattered his confidence that he could keep his life at least as it was. His son, Julian, called our supervisor. He said we might be tested on all fronts in the next few days. He promised not to leave you alone if we don't stop ignoring his demands. Bill stared at the screen of his phone as if the text was the most gruesome punishment. He knew that Julian Harris was not a man to just talk to. He had money, connections, and power that Bill didn't have. And now, with each new step, Julian was coming closer and closer to his life. In the evening of the same day, a man in a suit appeared on his doorstep and introduced himself as a lawyer. He didn't bother with Bill and got straight to the point. "My client demands that you make amends and publicly apologize to the Harris family," the lawyer said with a cold expression. "Otherwise, we will be forced to sue you for attempted murder and bodily harm." These words struck Bill to the core. He tried to resist, refused to accept reality, but all he could do was listen. He had been accused of committing a crime, and now he had to pay the price for his hatred. With every step, Julian Harris was destroying his life. The lawyer was only the beginning, the first swallow of what was yet to come. With each new challenge, with each new stage of this nightmare, Bill felt his inner world crumbling. What had once seemed possible was now costing too much. He replayed over and over in his mind the moment he dropped the piano. He couldn't tear himself away from that image of it flying down. That act, unthinking and poisoned by hatred, was a moment that changed not only his victim's life, but his own as well. Now, as his life grew tighter and more desperate by the day, Bill began to realize that the cost of hate was too great to ignore. Chapter 10. Public Retribution, Condemnation and Shame. A few days after Julian Harris began to influence Bill's loved ones, the effects of his actions began to be felt in the heart of the city. News of the incident, which happened on a quiet street, spread with incredible speed, and now every news story, every new report related to this terrible incident was a blow that knocked them off their feet. The first thing that happened was the direct coverage of the incident in the local news. There was no attempt to silence or minimize the situation. Local TV anchors were not shy about giving details, including the very moment the piano fell, and its aftermath. The image of an elderly man who barely survived the horror became a symbol of the agony that many people from disadvantaged backgrounds endured. Shocking attack downtown. Man nearly kills elderly black man by throwing a piano off the balcony of his home. The headlines on the television screens shone like red lights, tearing up the night. With each new issue, the details grew more grim. The reports showed not only the moment of tragedy, but also the statements of eyewitnesses, the outrage of citizens who could not believe that something so cruel could happen in their city. The rabid hatred behind this act was how Bill's own motivation was characterized on the news. This was not just revenge, but something far more dangerous and sinister. Racists and prejudiced people, though few in number, now felt that their views were not something to be left in the shadows. Bill appeared to symbolize everything they hated so much about them, and that was only the beginning. No matter how hard Bill tried to stay calm, each new report brought him closer and closer to the edge. The faces on the screen were full of indignation and condemnation, and the phone was ringing off the hook. Friends, colleagues, and even neighbors no longer had their contempt. "We knew he was a strange man, but we didn't expect this." These words from neighbors, recorded on video, went viral on social media, and then appeared in frontline newscasts. Crowds of people, from toddlers to adults, were now engaged in fierce discussions about the incident in stores, bus stops, and cafes. Bill found himself at the center of discussions not only in the city, but also on the internet. Internet trolls and haters quickly took control of the situation by launching a campaign of harassment. Without exception, all comments, posts, and videos that mentioned his address or personal information became objects of public condemnation. Threats and curses began to spread on social media. Bill was told that he should burn in hell and that no one would forget his actions. And it wasn't just complaints or sideways insults. Real threats were added to them. Bill became the object of popular retaliation. It was not just an insult to his actions, but an attempt to destroy his reputation, to uproot his personality. No amount of apologies or attempts to justify himself could stop this torrent of hatred. But the worst of it all began when the media began to bring up the subject of racism. Multiple experts came on the scene, trying to explain that the act was not an accident, but the embodiment of a deep racial hatred that permeated society. It became obvious to many that Bill was not just a violent man, but also part of a larger, and to some extent, cult-like problem. The man who dropped the piano is not just a criminal. He is a symbol of racism in our society. This is how one of the experts in the program commented on this situation. This is where research began to emerge, evidence of how often such acts of aggression were a manifestation not only of personal anger, but also of systemic bias. Stories of racism becoming the cause of violence began to circulate everywhere. All thoughts of Bill turned to the pathetic, disgusting truth that he could now not escape. Later it became known that Julian Harris decided not to limit himself only to the court and criminal charges. He declared his readiness to personally meet with people who shared his values and actively supported any actions that could free society from people like Bill. The media was quick to pick up on this statement, adding to the already rapidly unfolding harassment. Bill increasingly felt his life becoming unbearable. He could no longer go outside without being caught on camera. People whispered behind his back. Every look was full of judgment and contempt. He stopped talking to his neighbors and colleagues because they either avoided him completely or, as it turned out later, simply expected him to leave town. As the days passed, Bill realized more and more that there was no going back for him. His life had changed forever. The vengeance he had expected to bring upon his victim had come upon him with even greater force. And now that his own life had been destroyed, he had become a trap for himself, trapped in this endless cycle of shame and condemnation. Each day brought more and more realization that his act was more than an act of cruelty. It became the destruction of himself, consumed in his remorse and the realization that he had not only destroyed his enemy's life, but his own as well. When everything seemed doomed and inevitable, when every glance from the world around him became more mocking and judgmental, Bill found himself consumed with thoughts of his past. His path had not been straight, and even now, as life crumbled before him, he could not escape those memories. He tried to run away from them, but they came back again and again, mercilessly and violently, like dark waves engulfing his consciousness. Long before he became the man everyone now despised, Bill had been just a boy. His upbringing had been imbued with other principles, cruel, restrictive, hateful. His father, George Kane, was the one who had laid the foundations of his views in him. George was a man whose beliefs were based on fear and anger. He did not think it necessary to hide his hatred of other races. And Bill, as a young boy, adopted all these views without question. Every morning his father told him that black people were not like us, that their place is down there, and that you should never trust anyone who looks different. His mother, Caroline, was a more reserved woman, but she, too, had no power to resist her husband's will. Everything in their home was arranged so that Bill grew up in an atmosphere of domination and contempt. At dinners, they discussed events on the street, constantly asserting that black people were a menace to order and unfit for normal life. Little Bill listened to these conversations, and every time someone in their circle dared to object, his father would angrily explain that this was the way the world worked, and there could be no other way. It was these conversations that instilled in Bill a sense of fear of others, a feeling that he had to defend his side or his life would be jeopardized. With each passing year, this internal conflict only grew stronger. As a teenager, after the death of his father, Bill decided that the most important thing was not only to share his father's views, but to defend them at all costs. Fear and feelings of being disadvantaged throughout his youth caused him to shut down in his bubble of hate. He could not accept those who were not like him. This fear of foreignness and isolation from other walks of life became the basis for his aggressive attitude towards life. He began to cast glances at those who might challenge his opinion and instantly despise them. That's how Bill built his world. But no hate is without consequences. More often than not, such people become hostages to their own fears and complexes. In his case, as in the case of many other people, suffering from the feeling of his own vulnerability, could not find an outlet except in aggression. It was this inner feeling of inferiority that made him run away from any manifestation of compassion and love for those who were alien to his worldview. He could never admit that other people, regardless of skin color, could be better or more worthy. As Bill grew older, he began to organize his life around the same principles he had grown up with. He decided that he would work in a field where his power connections, and influence would help him maintain his security. Little did he know that these same connections would one day destroy his life. The piano he dropped was only a reflection of all his fear and pain buried in his soul. That moment was the culmination of everything he had learned, not in fighting for his position peacefully, but in breaking, destroying, and subjugating. His life was poisoned with hatred, hidden behind a wall of confidence and self-respect. As he found himself in the middle of all this horror, he began to realize that everything he had once taught and believed was now literally consuming him. His hands were filthy not only from the blood, but from the fear he had carried through his life, the fear that he had never been able to rid himself of the prejudices that his father had once instilled in him. And now that the world was upon him, That fear was his only companion. He thought he could control everything that happened around him, that he would be lifted up, but instead, he had become one of those he had once despised. And now that his own reputation was ruined, he couldn't help but wonder what was left of the man he had been, and who was he now that the whole town, the whole country, saw him as something hateful, as the embodiment of the evil he had carried within him for so long. Fear became his shadow, fear that there would never be forgiveness, that his past could never be erased. There was no more room inside him for excuses. He was afraid that even if he admitted his mistake, everything he had done would stay with him forever. At the moment when it seemed that events had reached their logical point, when Bill stood on the edge of a cliff, not knowing what his future would look like, came the final twist of fate. His life, shattered by his own hands, was on the brink of total destruction. However, it was not the end, but the beginning of the most important lesson of his life. After a week of relentless harassment, lawsuits, and public shaming, Bill found himself at the center of a new wave of media coverage. It seemed that now he would be forever rejected by society. But this was not the end of his journey. His trial attracted the attention of higher authorities, and the court was attended not only by representatives of local authorities, but also by human rights organizations, which took up his case with particular fury. The media attention to the incident only increased with each passing day. The impact was so significant that his case sparked reactions not only in the country but also abroad. This was not just a local crime, it was a demonstration that many could not accept. It was at that very moment, however, that an unexpected turn occurred. Bill, standing in the dock, met the gaze of the elderly man on whom he had dropped the piano, the very man whose life had been practically destroyed and whose suffering had come to symbolize all that was wrong in society. That look was full of surprise, but not rage. It was not a look of hatred or revenge. It was a look that reflected much more than that. It was a look of forgiveness, a forgiveness that required no words, no excuses, just a silence that said it all. The man whose son had turned out to be a powerful man in town stood next to him in the courtroom. He wasn't angry with Bill. He was saddened, disappointed. He knew that hate, like any contagion, doesn't go away on its own. It is passed from generation to generation, and even if it can be fought, it takes time. But most importantly, his son, Julian Harris, who had once been the prime mover behind the allegations against Bill, was himself, in his own way, part of that struggle, calling for public forgiveness and rehabilitation. At the trial, when all eyes were fixed on Bill, waiting for his last excuse or exculpatory gesture, suddenly the voice of that same elderly man came through. He said, "Hate hasn't made us stronger. We don't need another victim." These words were not just an act of mercy. They became a symbol of how, despite years of violence, racism, and prejudice, even in the most dire circumstances, a path to healing can be found. The court's decision was unexpected. Instead of sending Bill to prison for many years, he was offered a strict community sentence to undergo a recovery and psychological rehabilitation program. He was to work with victims of racism and assist in educational programs to overcome prejudice and violence. His life, now fundamentally changed, was dedicated to work that showed him how deeply rooted fears, hatred, and ignorance were in society. But most importantly, he became part of a program that gave people a chance to learn to understand and forgive. Throughout his time with the project, Bill realized one important lesson: hate, like violence, always turns against the one who sows it. You can't consider yourself strong until you learn to forgive. You can't feel victorious if your victory is only destruction. Eventually, even Bill, who could not have expected his life to turn this way, began to feel what it was like to be on the side of those he had once despised. But there was something inexpressibly important about the fact that he could change. It was the lesson of understanding and remorse that was what he took away from all those terrible events. And in that moment, as his life came to its new understanding, he realized that his personal punishment was not in prison, but in living with that realization every day. And perhaps that was his real punishment. But in the end, he realized it was the only way to atone for his mistakes, the only way to understand and feel the full weight of hatred so that he could finally fight it. Friends, what do you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced racism in your life, or have you faced similar violent situations? Your opinion is very important to us, and every word you say matters. We appreciate each and every one of you, and your support. You really help develop our channel, and without you none of this would be possible. Don't forget to give us a like if you liked it and subscribe, so you don't miss the new stories we have in store for you. Thank you for being with us, and we wish you a good day.